Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. This is another one of our virtual tours. We have a bunch of virtual tours already available on our website, hdc.org, and also on our YouTube channel. Just Google Historic Districts Council. For any of you who don't know, the Historic Districts Council is the citywide advocate for New York City's historic neighborhoods. We often do many in-person walking tours throughout the spring, summer, and fall, and of course have switched over to virtual tours to continue the fun exploration of New York City. So this is a special one, which I don't think we've ever really done, a look at co-op housing in New York. So this should be very, very fascinating. Lucy did a tour for us last week, which is also up on our YouTube channel. You can check that out. And with that, I will hand it over to Lucy. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. Hi, everybody. My name is Lucy Levine. It's really wonderful to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much for coming out to a history of cooperative housing in New York City, and thank you so much to the Historic Districts Council for having me. I actually asked HDC if I could share this lecture because this is a topic in New York City history that fascinates me personally, as does the suffrage movement, which is a tour that I gave for HDC last week. But this one in particular, I don't think gets as much attention as it should, and I think that this is a really salient moment to speak about the history of cooperative housing, because we're in a moment, of course, in New York City and throughout the country and even the world, when the notion of home and a place to call home is more important, perhaps, than ever. And while co-ops in New York City are ubiquitous today, when they came on the scene in New York City in 1881, they were actually described by the New York Times as a revolution in housing. And as we consider the city's current housing crisis and what we can do perhaps to revolutionize housing, I think that there is a real lesson in the history of cooperative housing. So cooperative housing comes on the scene in New York in 1881 thanks largely to this man, Philip Hubert. So cooperatives existed in Europe as early as the beginning of the 19th century, but they don't come to New York City until the year 1881, when Philip Hubert and another man, this is his partner, Jared Flagg, who was a clergyman and real estate enthusiast, got together and designed the city's first cooperative apartment house called the Rembrandt at 152 West 57th Street. This was designed in 1881. The photograph here is a tax photo from 1940. Now, the Rembrandt was a 6-story building with 11-room apartments. 8 shareholders lived in the building and then also rented other units to reduce operating costs. So it wasn't 100% cooperative as most co-ops are today. Now, the Rembrandt gives us the beginning of many things about cooperative apartments that we would recognize today, and also many features that we wouldn't. So the Rembrandt was aimed by Hubert and what Hubert called his Hubert Home Clubs to, quote, people of means and good social standing, and also to artists who were considered comfortable with an unusual, and in this case, totally new to New York, style of living. And that's why it was called a revolution, because it was totally new, this idea of the cooperative. And also, when we talk about being marketed to artists, we will talk about the original artist studio co-ops, but that's the reason why this building was called the Rembrandt. It was marketed as an artist's building, and of course the reference is to Rembrandt, the great Dutch master. But the question is, why would this be a revolution in 1881 when it's so ubiquitous today? Well, the city in 1881, in certain ways, is completely different from our own. In a lot of ways, is actually quite similar, which is another reason that this idea of the cooperative is so salient at this moment. And that in 1881, New York was in really the height of its Gilded Age. So this was a city of haves and have-nots. It was a city of homeowners and tenement dwellers, right? So New York City at that time, the upper and middle classes either owned or rented private homes. Now, as private homes go, this is one of the most illustrious. This was Cornelius Vanderbilt II's mansion at 1 West 57th Street. It was built in 1883, demolished 1926. So when we're talking about what we would consider to be the Gilded Age, you had homes like this, but you also had gracious brownstones, which are still with us, and row houses in New York City. So even when we don't see this, we can still see remnants of those single family homes. So you had these incredible single family homes, and because of that, Victorian understandings of privacy held that multiple family dwellings were suspect, right? Anybody who was living in a multiple family dwelling must have, according to this sort of Victorian sensibility, must have to be poor. And so you had something like this, and then of course you had the tenements, which were cramped and which were home almost exclusively to the working classes. And even if there were middle class people living in multiple dwellings, that wouldn't have really reached the radar of New York's upper echelons. That anybody who owned a single family home would never have considered moving into any kind of apartment. And there won't be what we would consider respectable apartments in New York at all until the 1870s. But they don't become serious really until 1880. So in 1880, we get something new, which is called a French flat. And this is the most famous French flat. This is the Manhattan Apartments at 244 West, at 244 East 86th Street. I'm sorry that I did not put that on the PowerPoint, but it's 86th Street and 2nd Avenue, designed by Charles W. Clinton in 1880. Now, the Manhattan is not a cooperative, but I put it in this lecture and tour because it really shows us how we get from this understanding of a tenement to an understanding of what will become a cooperative apartment building, which is to say that this was considered something new. So the French flat stood out from other tenements because it was 4 times larger than the familiar tenement, and it took up the entire site of the building lot. It was 100 by 100 feet, and that made it a really sharp contrast to the ubiquitous 25-foot wide tenement that really filled the city's working class quarters, because that size, 25 by 25, was actually dictated as early as 1811 in the commissioner's plan that divided New York into its grid and gave us our uniform sized lots. So that's what New York looked like. It was built up that way very conspicuously. And this was totally beyond that. And in addition to more space, the Manhattan also offered amenities that would have been totally unknown to other multiple dwelling types of buildings. So you had fully equipped kitchens, you had steam heat, you had dumbwaiters, you had hallways within units to provide separate entrances to bedrooms. You had light and air. These amenities also made this the largest building in the micro neighborhood of Yorkville. And according to the New York Times, this is the oldest surviving large apartment house in New York City. Not only that, not only was it so much larger, it also had fewer tenants, which made it seem less cramped and less akin to the tenement model. So it became palatable to the middle classes. Now, other things that made the French flat in 1880 appeal to the middle and upper classes in New York City, who would really for the first time consider living in anything that was not a single family home, um, was that something like this required much fewer servants than an opulent single family home would. And if you were to travel, it was much safer. It was considered harder to break into, because who were you stealing from? If you were walking down the street and you saw Cornelius Vanderbilt's the second's mansion, you knew it was his, and you knew. But in this case, you wouldn't. So this gave a level of security that the upper and middle classes became sort of okay with. Now, the reason then that cooperatives become even more important is that co-ops, especially the early ones, which are built really for the upper middle class and wealthy echelons of New York society, offered everything that the Manhattan apartments offered and more. So it went beyond the French flats. The early co-ops, of which the Chelsea Hotel is actually one, were built as duplexes, so they could be totally differentiated architecturally from anything that felt like a tenement. Not only that, they were even more exclusive than something like a French flat, because you were able to choose your neighbors. We have, as early as the Rembrandt in 1881, the first co-op, the advent of the co-op board, right? So when Hubert is talking about marketing these homes, or the idea of home ownership through cooperative apartments to the respectable classes, what he's saying is it's a form of gatekeeping, that anybody who buys into this syndicate can choose who else they live with. So that was very attractive to this Victorian sense of exclusivity. And really, that sense of exclusivity is what makes the original co-ops so successful in New York when they come on the scene. Because he's not only offering home ownership, he's also offering something else, which is this idea of the apartment hotel. It is not a coincidence that the Chelsea Hotel is called that, because the original Hubert home clubs offered hotel amenities. So they would be maintained by a full staff. They would also offer hotel dining options, like cooperative kitchens, cooperative dining facilities, various concierge services. There was what when we consider luxury buildings today, those amenities come out of the cooperative movement, that this is the first time that you have apartment buildings that are offering something well above and beyond what you could get in traditional multiple dwellings in New York City, which were tenements, where in an obvious way, you're not going to get hotel services. But something like this, the Chelsea Hotel, was in a serious way saying, you get what you sign up for, which is this incredible hotel service. Now, Hubert, when he sees the incredible success of his Rembrandt, he creates other home clubs, of which the Chelsea Hotel is one. This is 222 West 23rd Street. It was built between 1883 and 1885. And in those same years, other developers realize the sort of cachet of the early co-ops, realize that they can entice the middle classes to this new exclusive way of living, and they begin to create co-ops around Gramercy Park, around Madison Square, around Central Park South, especially because if you had these opulent buildings on parks, you could offer the idea of living in the sky. And the reason that you could offer that too, and the reason it's nice to talk about 34 Gramercy Park, which is the city's oldest surviving co-op, opened in 1883, is that this was also home to the city's first residential and being created at the exact same time that new technology like the Otis hydraulic elevator is making um, living on the top floor of an apartment building something that can be exciting, can be opulent, can be exclusive, versus something that's drudgery if you have to walk up the stairs. So, interestingly enough, though, these cooperatives were cooperative in the more egalitarian sense that we would use the word, because all of the apartments really went for the same amount of money regardless of what floor you were on, because the elevator was so new that cooperators did not actually in the 1880s realize that something like a penthouse, like a top floor apartment, could be even more exclusive, even more sought after. And so in a building like this, all of the apartments offered 10 rooms per apartment and sold between $10,000 and $20,000. And prices did not differ by floor, even though this building was the earliest in the city as a residential building to have an elevator. And that sense of egalitarianism extended also to other cooperative elements within the building. So this building on Gramercy Park would buy commodities like coal or meat in bulk and then share them building wide. So when we talk about the idea of the cooperative as a almost socialistic endeavor, we will actually see that happen with workers' cooperatives into the 1920s in New York. But it's interesting to me that this really begins as a very opulent idea and yet still harkens back to this idea of sharing and a communal goal. And the reason they're actually able to deal in these communal terms is that, again, as I said, they're choosing their neighbors. There is this co-op board, which is why also the early co-ops are remarkably beautiful. Look how beautiful this is. The reason that these early co-ops were able to have such incredible detailing and truly beautiful architectural bona fides is that because the people who were living in the building were the people who were financing the building, they were willing to spend more money to hire more sought after architects to really go the distance, because this was not speculative, right? This was not for somebody else to live in. These were homes for people who were choosing very conspicuously to buy into them. But the first generation of co-ops comes to an end pretty quickly after it began. So in 1885, we really have the downfall of this first generation of co-ops. This is really Hubert's hubris, is what I will call this. In 1885, he planned this. It was his Navarro flats at Central Park South and 7th Avenue, which was slated to have more than 100 apartments. But Hubert never actually transferred the land title to the cooperative corporation. And when he overran his cost estimates, the building actually went into foreclosure even before it opened. And so it opened as a rental property. It never actually became a co-op. And he failed, and the cooperative movement really fails with him in New York until essentially the turn of the 20th century. So this was an effort on Central Park South, and it will not be the last, because the southern end of Central Park will become a hot commodity for the next wave of cooperative development, which emerges as the 20th century takes shape. And what we get are artists' cooperatives. If you recall, the first cooperative was the Rembrandt, which marketed in a way to artists, but by the turn of the 20th century, it will not just be a name like Rembrandt, not just an artistic cachet, but truly the birth of the readily available artist studio. So the first artist studios in New York that were ever built were not cooperative. They were built on 10th Street, 51 West 10th Street, in 1857 by Richard Morris Hunt. And they were owned by the art collector James B. Johnson and did a great deal of sort of promotion of the idea of Greenwich Village as an artist's haven. This is part of why, because these are the first artist studios that spring up in that neighborhood. But as the 19th century wears on, not too many people follow Richard Morris Hunt's lead, and there are not that many artist studios that are actually built in New York City. You have very few that exist. You have the Bryant Park Studios at 80 West 40th Street, and the Carnegie Studios at on West 57th Street, but they don't meet the actual demands of the artists who need them. Not only are there not enough of these studios, but they are not built to the specifications of actual artists. And that's why cooperatives become so perfectly matched to the idea of the artist studio, because if the artists come together to actually fund the building, they can decide what it will look like. And so at the turn of the 20th century, you get syndicates of artists in New York City who decide that they are going to create the perfect working and living quarters specifically for artists. So we have, under the cooperative model, the popularization, not the birth, because the birth comes with Richard Morris Hunt in 1857, but the popularization of what we now understand as the studio apartment. Now, these studios were not what we would call a studio today, right? A studio apartment today, we can make a joke that it's just like a closet. These were huge, okay? These are the very first cooperative studio apartments. These were begun in 1901. They were built by Henry Ranger and Walter Russell, who gathered together a group of artists to finance this. This is the 67th Street Studio Building, a 12-story co-op at 27 West 67th Street. And if we look at this, this was Milton Glazer's old apartment, actually. Now, this building was completed in 1903 to the artist-specific specifications. And what I want you to look at here is not only the incredible height of the ceilings, but also the windows in particular. The windows are the most important part of the artist cooperatives, and they were built that way for a reason. The early artist cooperatives, you can actually tell when you walk through the streets of New York which buildings were built as early artist co-ops, because they will have double or triple height northern exposed windows. So the artists specifically needed northern exposure, and they needed double or triple height windows. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that makes sense, but why are there so many studio buildings all in the same place? In fact, speaking of 67th Street, there were actually 8 artist cooperative studio buildings that were built on 67th Street alone. And today, we actually call that the West 67th Street Artist Colony Historic District. Not only that, you also had studios along Central Park South and along 57th Street, and there's a real reason for that. One is that 57th Street was home to a variety of arts organizations, including the Art Students League and, of course, Carnegie Hall. And so 57th Street was known as Artists Alley. And also, 59th Street, as you know, is the southern end of Central Park. And so around the southern end of Central Park, so 57th Street, 59th Street, 67th Street, so on and so forth, really anywhere between, below 70th Street, is perfect for what these artists are looking for, which is that northern exposure to the light. Because if you're facing Central Park, there's nothing actually blocking your light. It's so interesting to me, the issue that we have now of these super tall buildings around the park and all of the advocacy, particularly on the part of the Historic Districts Council and other wonderful preservation organizations who are trying so hard to preserve that light. I think that the artists from the early cooperatives would have very much been part of that effort were they around today, because that was their goal, was to get that incredible light streaming in from the park. Now, here is another wonderful studio building. This is actually called the Studio Building at 131 East 66th Street, designed by Charles Platt, finished 1907. It took 3 years to build. This was advertised with double height ceilings and windows. You can actually see inside. Those are 28-foot ceilings that you see. What I love about this building is that it also has an incredible social history, which is that when it was advertised as having no dark rooms, and so it was home to a jazz age painter by the name of Gerald Murphy and his wife Sarah. Now, Gerald and Sarah were friends with F. Scott Fitzgerald, and they are actually the inspiration for Dick and Nicole Driver in his 1934 novel Tender is the Night. So if we look through New York, we can see not only its architectural history, but also its literary history here in and around Artist Alley, which is very fun. So what we can see with the cooperative model is that in a really structural way, these buildings are built for the people who occupy them, that these buildings are built for artists by artists. But that's not to say that only artists lived in the artist studios. That's, of course, not true today when we think about studio apartments, and it wasn't true then. There were many rich people at the time, around the turn of the 20th century, who wanted to live like artists, as there are such people today. And so you had bankers, you had lawyers, so on and so forth, moving into what they considered to be this kind of bohemian kind of building, which was to live in these artists' cooperatives. And what begins to happen as we move into the First World War is that there is a foundation being laid, because of the war itself, for an even wider interest in cooperatives. And this happens for a couple of reasons. First of all, after the First World War, there is a huge rent hike and massive inflation in New York City. Massive inflation throughout the country and a huge rent hike in New York City. Now, this brought cooperative living as we know it to luxury buildings on Park and Fifth Avenue. Before the First World War, I had been talking about the growth of the French flat and the idea of the luxury apartment as opposed to tenements. And that would grow and grow and grow in the early years of the 20th century until you had these very opulent apartments on Park and Fifth Avenues. But because of this incredible inflation, the wealthy renters on Park and Fifth Avenue come to a consensus that is still conventional wisdom in New York City to this day, which holds that it makes a greater long-term financial sense to own your apartment than to rent it. And in the wake of that understanding, it was no longer necessary for cooperatives to be financed by tenant syndicates. So it was no longer necessary for cooperatives of, let's say, artists to build artist housing. It was now known that because it made so much financial sense to buy into your apartment, to be definitely an owner, to be part of this cooperative corporation, then anybody, if you build it, they will come. That if speculative builders began now in the wake of the First World War to put up um, incredible buildings throughout the city, that wealthy um, homeowners who at another time would have bought single family homes are now willing, ready, and able to buy into these luxury co-ops, which they do. And buildings like this one, 969 Park Avenue, which was built in 1911, of course, before the First World War, goes co-op, as we say, right? It has a co-op conversion. So we often think of co-op conversions, you know, as occurring in New York in the 70s and 80s. But actually, the first co-op conversions really began in the 1920s, following this inflation after the First World War. But this is not only a lecture about opulent housing, because the First World War also leads to the foundation of middle and working class cooperatives. So after World War I, not only do we have, as I keep saying, this inflation, this rent hike, but also we have a housing shortage in New York City, and we have significant population growth, as well as an early interest in suburbia. So what comes out of this is this incredible need for housing and the goal of keeping middle-class New Yorkers in New York, right? And not allowing them to move out to somewhere like Tuxedo Park, which had become very, very popular in the 1920s, things like that. But keeping them in New York, and how do you do that? And that was the urban-suburban divide, and how do you bridge that? And the idea of how to bridge that begins with the garden apartment here at Hudson View Gardens in Washington Heights in 1923. Now, garden apartments, by and large, were built in the outer boroughs, because the outer boroughs were built up in a way as the earliest suburbs of Manhattan. This becomes possible after the expansion of the subway in 1913. We have an almost tripling, certainly more than doubling, but almost tripling of the reach of the subway after 1913. And what that does is open the then bucolic reaches of the Bronx and Queens and Brooklyn to large-scale development. And so you were able to have entire planned communities. Now, this one that I'm showing you, Hudson View Gardens, was built in Washington Heights, and it was a community of what were known as Scarsdale Tudor. So if we're talking about the suburbs, it actually was a reference to the suburb of Scarsdale in Westchester, but it was this Tudor-style garden apartment housing. This stands between 182nd Street and 186th Streets. And not only that, you actually had, as I said, the building of entire communities. So before we get there, let's look inside the courtyard of Hudson View Gardens. When we talk about garden apartments, it's literally the garden in the city, right? You can see this foliage and so on and so forth, and these castles in the sky, but the point is that you have light and air and space and yards like you might have in the suburbs, and totally oppositional to, you know, the cramped sort of tenement model, which is what people were leaving behind. It was a very conspicuous idea that if you were going to take the subway out to these new planned communities, you are leaving the core of the city. And the core of the city at that time would have been something like the tenement districts of the Lower East Side. And when you left, where could you go? Well, you would go to these new communities. Jackson Heights is one. Jackson Heights as a neighborhood, the entirety of Jackson Heights was actually created by the Queensboro Corporation, which stood out, and you can see it here, as the largest community of cooperatively owned garden apartments under single management in the entire world. Now, this was also a strikingly modern development because it was advertised through mass media, through campaigns on the radio. So think about what makes these cooperatives possible. You have the subway that gets you there, you have the radio that makes people aware of this, you have the elevator that makes these much larger, much taller buildings convenient in a way that tenements would not have been. And so this is a marriage of like the pastoral and the ultra-modern, which I think is a really interesting juxtaposition. This question of like, you know, how can we have this sort of romantic pastoral suburban experience within this ultra-modern experience of urban life? And this is what the cooperatives give you. Now, when I say that these are cooperatives, it means to a large degree that they were restricted. Jackson Heights, in particular, stipulated in its promotional literature that no Catholics, Jews, or dogs were allowed within the grounds, and certainly no people of color. But then we have this man. This is Governor Al Smith. If there is an Al Smith fan club on this earth, I would like to be president of the Al Smith fan club. I love Al Smith. Al Smith was the first Irishman to be governor of New York State, and somebody told him, oh, you know, we don't want the riffraff in Albany. He said, the riffraff, I am the riffraff, right? And so he had a real understanding of the needs of working class people, working class New Yorkers. He was a loyal son of South Street. He grew up on the South Street seaport. He worked in the Fulton Fish Market. That was the man he was. And so under his leadership, Al Smith passes the New York State Limited Dividend Housing Companies Act, which offers tax abatements for 20 years and allows middle income cooperative housing projects to be backed by labor unions, by amalgamated banks, by life insurance companies, so on and so forth. And this paves the way for workers' cooperatives in the 1920s. And this is a major game changer in New York City. Now, this actually brings us to what I think is the most interesting part of this lecture, which is the rise of union-backed workers' cooperatives. But the idea of the nonprofit co-op actually begins a little bit before Al Smith and 1926. It actually begins 10 years earlier in Brooklyn. Now, the very first nonprofit workers' cooperative apartments in the United States were built by Finnish immigrants in Sunset Park in 1916. These two buildings were actually part of HDC's Six to Celebrate in Sunset Park. So I know that they are beloved by HDC and certainly by anybody who is interested in cooperative housing or workers' housing in New York City. So these buildings stand at 816 and 826 43rd Street in Sunset Park. They were called Alku, which means beginning in Finnish, and Alku Toinen, Toinen meaning two, so beginning and beginning two, both built 1916. Now, when I say that these are nonprofit workers' cooperatives, what I mean is that when cooperators moved out, the co-op itself simply bought back ownership at the original price. So there were literally no profits to be made here. And the goal of these housing projects were that these were for home seekers, not profit seekers. So if you were looking to live in a stable community where you were invested in your building, you knew your neighbors, and you wanted to stay long term, this was really the place for you. And you can see the way that that would build a very tight-knit community, and in fact, it did in Sunset Park. By 1926, so 10 years after these buildings are built, there were at least 25 Finnish cooperatives in a 7-block radius of Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And this became the rise of what was then called Finntown. So the entirety of this ethnic community is really built up around these cooperatives. These and subsequent labor cooperatives were organized along the original Rochdale principles, which were codified in the 1840s, actually 1844, by the Rochdale Society of Equitable Pioneers in Rochdale, England, who created the cooperative movement. They pioneered the idea of cooperative housing and cooperative stores, so on and so forth. And so whenever you see two trees like this in a circle, you know that you are dealing with a cooperative enterprise. These principles, the Rochdale principles, have been updated throughout the years, but as of 1995, which was the last time they were updated, those principles are voluntary and open membership, democratic member control, member economic participation, autonomy and independence, education, training, and information in the cooperative enterprise, cooperation among cooperatives, and concern for community. Now, few people exemplify this concern for community better than Abraham Kazan. Abraham Kazan is considered to be the father of cooperative housing in the United States of America. And he took the Rochdale principles, and they really informed his development of what will become large-scale labor cooperatives, the first and the most successful large-scale labor cooperatives in the United States. Kazan, as the father of cooperative housing, and particularly workers' cooperative housing, built over 100,000 homes throughout New York City for working and middle-class people. Kazan grew up on the Lower East Side, and he saw firsthand, because he lived it, the truly appalling experience of living in tenement conditions, and he understood that people's lives were profoundly affected by their living conditions. He also understood that most people, specifically most working people, could not afford adequate housing, so he decided that he would build it himself. He was keyed into a certain mindset and a certain web of organizations that made this possible. One is that he was the head of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Credit Union, which was a financial cooperative institution for members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America, which was at the time the largest garment workers union in the United States. So here we have our garment workers. Al Smith's 1926 Limited Dividend Housing Companies Act allowed Kazan to help revolutionize workers' housing because it allowed the unions to finance these projects, but the unions did not need to own them. So the buildings that he's going to build, and I will show them to you in a moment, were actually owned by the cooperators themselves. And those cooperators, because they were in large part union members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, could actually get loans from the Amalgamated Bank, of which Kazan was head. So you had this whole ecosystem within the labor movement of making it possible for working class people to own their homes, when that would not have been possible outside of this cooperative movement. And this arrangement in particular grows not only out of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, but what is really a wider Jewish labor movement that's functioning in New York City at this time. So since workers in the needle trades, and thereby members of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union, were overwhelmingly Jewish immigrants, many of New York's earliest workers' cooperatives had their roots in the Jewish labor movement, which was flourishing on the Lower East Side. And members of that labor movement would, through union-backed cooperatives, begin to build self-consciously utopian communities in the outer boroughs, particularly in the Bronx. So here we have the oldest still functional limited equity housing cooperative in the nation. These are the amalgamated, this is the Amalgamated Housing Cooperative, built at 98 Van Cortlandt Park South in the Bronx. So again, when I was talking about the very early luxury cooperatives that are built around Gramercy Park, that are built around Madison Square, that are built around Central Park South, it's this idea of living in the air, of living in the sky, because you're living around the park and you get this incredible amount of sun, northern exposure from Central Park, so on and so forth. And so the goal here of these garment workers is that they too can have this park experience. Right, that they too can live on the park. So it's very specific what they're choosing when they're building this cooperative on Van Cortlandt Park South. It is because they are looking for this greenery, and not only are they looking for the greenery, they're also looking for that nod to the garden apartment that we saw in Jackson Heights, that we saw in Hudson View Gardens, this idea that here were these middle-class models, and through the workers' cooperatives, well, a working class person could have that too. And the reason that you have this beautiful uniformity of the garden apartment throughout these labor cooperatives is that they were all built really by the same people. So you have Abraham Kazan really at the head of this, and then he has his architects. So these were designed chiefly by Springsteen and Goldhammer, beginning in 1927, and then by the architect Herman Jesser, who will become the chief architect throughout into the 1970s of union cooperative housing. Now, Jesser himself was a New Yorker. He was educated at Cooper Union and at Stuyvesant High School, so he came out of the New York socialist left. That was who he was, and it was that identity that these cooperatives were really catering to. And what's interesting to me is that when we talk about political identity in these housing cooperatives, they were very self-consciously utopian communities. So we'll see what these workers were able to create. It was the idea of dignity in workers' housing, right? You can see these incredible fountains, these incredible gardens, that you could be a worker, that you could have the salary of a garment worker and live this way. And so what they created here was, here we have a classroom at the Amalgamated School. We have a supermarket, a cooperative supermarket. We have a level of comfort in these homes that you would never have found in a tenement. And in particular, they're built conspicuously with things like cross ventilation and eat-in kitchens and subway tiling on the floor. You can see how bright, how spacious, how beautiful these are. And it's this idea of a revolution in workers' housing, that you can live on a working man's budget in a truly clean, beautiful, whoa, sorry about that, everybody, in a truly clean, beautiful apartment. Um, and what's interesting about them is that this idea of the Jewish labor movement and this goal that they have, which is truly a cooperative way of life. So not only these cooperative homes, but also, as we saw, the cooperative schools, the cooperative markets, they had cooperative summer camps, they had cooperative auditoriums, you know, they had cooperative libraries, you name it, they had it. It was a full way of life. And each of the cooperatives really had their own sort of bent within this Jewish labor movement. So beginning with with the amalgamated housing. So the amalgamated was designed not only by Kazan and the Clothing Workers Union, but also it was backed by loans from the Jewish Daily Forward. So it was attuned to the socialist ideals of another Abraham Kazan, who was the leader of the Jewish Daily Forward, the founding editor, who believed that the Forward building on West Broadway was a temple of socialism, and that this would be really its apotheosis, that if you were going to try to live according to the values of the Jewish Daily Forward, you would live this way. What's interesting when we look at this is that now we have the workers' cooperative colony. It was actually nicknamed the Coops, not co-ops, Coops, rhymes with hoops, and everybody who lived there called themselves Koopniks. This was built in 1926. It still stands, but it's no longer cooperative. It was built at 2700 Bronx Park East. Now, the difference between the Koopniks and the amalgamated cooperators is that the Koopniks were further left, and they actually called the socialist garment workers who read the Forward the right wing, because these workers read the Morgan Freiheit, which was an anarchist newspaper, and so they were self-consciously actually Soviet in ideology, even after that went out of fashion. So even into the 1950s. And it's very interesting to me that Calvin Trilling, writing in the New Yorker as late as 1977, in his New York diary, writes about the Coops, and he says that the mere address of 2700 Bronx Park East was an indication of who you were, what paper you read, what your ideology was. And if you go to these buildings still to this day, you will see a hammer and sickle carved over the entrances. The next cooperative that was built in the 1920s among sort of the Jewish labor cooperatives in the Bronx, these are the Farband houses. The Farband houses, these were built by the Jewish National Workers Alliance of America in 1928. So the Jewish National Workers Alliance was a bulwark in New York City of labor Zionism. And then lastly, you had the Shalom Aleichem houses, which were built at 238th Street, which is also no longer cooperative. I can see that I have a typo here. That's supposed to be Shalom Aleichem, the great Yiddish writer. Now that was conspicuous. The goal of the Shalom Aleichem houses was to propagate and preserve secular Yiddish culture. And so they put on plays every week. You know, it was this idea of always living within utopia, always living your creed. And so these Shalom Aleichem houses actually created the first library branch in that part of the Bronx. And when the New York Public Library actually opened a branch nearby, the Shalom Aleichem houses donated their entire collection to the New York Public Library. You know, that they already had that library because they already had cooperative theaters, they already had cooperative grocery stores, They had cooperative electrical generators. They had cooperative newspapers, cooperative cafeterias. You can see that this is a socially and ideologically cohesive way of life, that people who lived here thought of it as a cocoon, and that it was really, in a way, within the city because it's in the Bronx, but in a way outside of it. And you can see when we look at this architecturally that it was built in that way, that when we have these garden apartments that are facing in, that is conspicuous. They are not facing the city. They are not facing out. They are facing toward the garden, toward one another. And in a way, you can actually see the ideology of that that is not only the orientation of the building, but the orientation too of the community. But while these Jewish labor cooperatives are interesting to me because all of my great-grandmothers were members of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, I want to make it very, very clear that the Jewish labor movement is not the only part of the labor movement, and certainly not even the only labor or otherwise, not the only sponsors of cooperative housing under this 1926 limited dividend law, because you also had people that you might not expect, like John D. Rockefeller, financing nonprofit labor cooperatives, which is what's so wonderful about history, is that we learn things that we maybe would not have guessed. So here we have the Thomas Garden Apartments. Now, they are designed by Andrew W. Thomas, and named for him, and financed by John D. Rockefeller Jr. Now, these are also in the Bronx. They are at 840 Grand Concourse and designed between 1926 and 1927. Now, Andrew J. Thomas had also designed the community in Jackson Heights, and he is really considered to be the progenitor, the inventor of the garden apartment. So when we see the Thomas Garden Apartments, that's why these are named for him. So they're designed around an interior courtyard. And as we were speaking too about the idea of cooperative housing being sort of a cut above architecturally than perhaps tenements, because those who are living there are owning the building, we can see that too, that we have really beautiful terracotta surrounding the entrance to this building. So what has to be said about this, and it's very conspicuous, that in the same way that Jackson Heights was restricted, was segregated, so were the Thomas Garden Apartments. The Thomas Garden Apartments were whites only. And Rockefeller knew this, and that was purposeful on his part, because he says, okay, I'm going to do separate but equal, which is one of the great sins of this nation. And along those lines, he also funds this. These are the Dunbar Apartments in Harlem on West 149th Street and West 150th Streets, between Frederick Douglass Boulevard and Adam Clayton Powell Boulevard. They are named for the titan of the Harlem Renaissance, Paul Laurence Dunbar, the great Black poet. Now, they were designed by the exact same person, Andrew Thomas, who designed the Thomas Garden Apartments, and they were designed along the same kind of plan, which is that they were designed around an interior courtyard. So it's this idea, again, of the garden apartment, that every time we see these garden apartments, we see this particular plan. Now, the Dunbar Apartments was the first large cooperative aimed specifically at the Black market, at the Black community. And notable early cooperators in this development were W.E.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, A. Philip Randolph, and Bill Bojangles Robinson. So while we have an incredible roster of Black citizens living in these apartments, it's really important to realize that these are also strictly segregated. Just as the Thomas Garden Apartments were whites only, these were limited to Black cooperators. Now, when it comes to this idea of racist housing policy, a lot of people think of slum clearance, and cooperative housing actually is part of that. Now, for example, we have Cooperative Village on the Lower East Side, which was the first large urban renewal, as you might call it, development that came out of the terms of the 1926 limited dividend law. Interestingly, it was also developed by Abraham Kazan and the Amalgamated and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and the United Housing Foundation, which I will talk about in just a moment, and was built in many iterations between 1930 and 1959. It includes, in its final form, 4 cooperatives across 12 buildings and holds 4,500 apartments. Now, like the other sort of amalgamated dwellings in the Bronx, these apartments were designed by Springsteen and Goldhammer and by Herman Jesser. And all of the buildings in this complex are named after socialist labor leaders, and they originally featured socialist realist art murals. And you might be thinking, okay, you know, how does a socialist utopian labor cooperative get involved with something like slum clearance? And I think that one quote by David Dubinsky, who was the head of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, is really instructive. He said in 1953, "We have wiped out the sweatshop. We return to wipe out the slum." So it was this idea that labor leaders across New York genuinely believed that this was a progressive vision, that workers should not have to and did not have to, that they had proved in the Bronx, that workers did not have to live in substandard housing, that you could live in these truly comfortable, truly dignified cooperatives. And that's true. But what becomes interesting about the marriage of slum clearance and cooperative housing is that you get the passage of the 1949 Federal Housing Act, and we will see how Title I of the Federal Housing Act, and then in 1955 the Mitchell-Lama program, really gloms on to Kazan's ideas and marries these very, very, very progressive socialist ideals of fair labor housing to like major slum clearance projects in New York City. So, first of all, there is not really between the late 1920s, the first building in this complex was finished 1930. So really, between 1930 and the end of the Second World War, there's almost no cooperative building in New York City because of the Depression and then the war. And so what happens in the post-war years is that you get a couple of new cooperatives. So, for instance, you get Parkway Village, which was built in Queens in 1947 for UN workers. And the reason that it was built was because so many UN workers were people of color. They actually faced real housing discrimination elsewhere in New York City. So the idea was, okay, let's build an integrated community. And it moved beyond just UN workers in the 50s, and residents included Roy Wilkins and Betty Friedan. Now, in 1949, you also had Elecchester, which was designed by Harry Van Ardsdale of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. So Elecchester, you can understand how it got the name. This was a complex of 38 buildings on the site of a former country club in Queens that housed 5,500 people. Now, Van Arsdale himself actually lived in Elecchester, so again, it was this idea that cooperators were invested in their communities because they lived in them. And so Van Arsdale, when he's designing this, he's designing it for himself. And so he designs it with a public library, with a union-sponsored savings bank, with a coffee shop, with a cocktail lounge, with a bowling alley, with a large auditorium. And so you can see that these post-war co-ops are really taking Abraham Kazan's lead, this idea of union-backed labor housing that is really a totally codified community. So what Kazan realizes in the post-war years is that there are so many unions, not only the electrical workers, not only UN workers, but so many unions throughout New York City who want to do what the Amalgamated had been so successful at doing, which was create these union-backed houses. And so he says, okay, you know, there's power in numbers. That's the whole point of a union, right? So he coordinates in 1951 the United Housing Foundation, which was essentially a union of unions. The United Housing Foundation was a coalition that included 19 unions and made possible a vast expansion of workers' cooperatives in New York, building tens of thousands of units of housing. And as I said, that development in the post-war years was really helped along by two pieces of legislation, the 1949 Federal Housing Act and the 1955 Limited Profit Housing Companies Act, better known as the Mitchell-Lama program. So there we have the United Housing Foundation. And we'll come back for a moment to the cooperative village, because the cooperative village in Penn South really illustrate the marriage of the United Housing Foundation to Title I slum clearance. So Penn South and Cooperative Village are really quite interesting, because when you think of the 1949 Federal Housing Act, it's really stunning as a piece of legislation because it has these really lofty goals that seem to be akin to those of Kazan and the labor leaders, which is to eliminate slums and blighted areas in New York and provide decent housing for every American family, that this is a right in a way. But what happens? Well, who becomes the head of Title I slum clearance? Robert Moses, right? So Robert Moses decides, okay, when we say wipe out the slum, that's a racialized category. And what we're going to do now in the post-war years is something that the developers of garden apartments in the 20s were also trying to do, which was to keep middle-class New Yorkers from fleeing to the suburbs. So we have the creation now of union-backed and then also federally backed middle-class cooperative housing, which is how do you keep the middle of New York. And under Robert Moses and Title I, it is very conspicuously a white middle class. And so because you have now all of these federal subsidies, we have the sort of marriage of these two programs, which is Kazan's United Housing Foundation and the Title I programs. So there are really only two United Housing Foundation cooperative developments that are really sort of conspicuously tied to slum clearance. One is Cooperative Village, and the other is Penn South. So this was founded by the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, breaking ground in 1957. It will open in 1962. And it takes funds from Title I to create housing based on self-help and mutual aid for 2,800 families. And it has its own power plant, it has its own parking lot, its own gardens. So it's really within sort of Kazan's vision, but over 100 families who were living on this site before it was built were forced into simply public housing by the city itself. Now, Kazan made an effort in a real way to have 300 original families who were living on the site, move into this complex because he realized what was going on. And what's interesting is that this was hailed as an extremely progressive opening. When it opened May 17th, 1962, Kennedy, who was president, was on hand to cut the ribbon. It was this idea of wiping out the slum, having a new New York. But then, of course, this question of who gets to be part of the new New York, which is a question that we are still grappling with. Okay, so that's the slum clearance. And then we have Mitchell-Lama housing. So Mitchell-Lama housing is a limited dividend middle income housing program that has both minimum and maximum income requirements for residents. And this is really the basis for the Mitchell-Lama program. This is Morningside Gardens, which opened in 1957, so just 2 years after the passage of the program itself. It has 6 apartment houses, which together have 980 apartments within them. Now, this was supposed to be an integrated community, but actually it was 75% white when it was built, although Thurgood Marshall was an original cooperator. It was subsidized by the city under Mitchell-Lama. And interestingly, it was an early development on the part of David Rockefeller. So we can look back in our history of cooperative housing and realize that David Rockefeller, who is the son of John D. Rockefeller Jr., is sort of part of this through line that we see, this continuum. So we go from something like the Thomas Garden Apartments or the Dunbar Apartments now to Morningside Gardens. Interestingly enough, though, Kazan now, in the early 60s, after what happened at Penn South, after realizing, who is benefiting mostly from Mitchell-Lama, he says, okay, we're going to create a conspicuously integrated, very large scale cooperative housing development, which he does. This is called Rochdale Village. Now, this is in South Jamaica, Queens. At the time, South Jamaica was the 3rd largest Black community in New York City, behind Harlem and Bed-Stuy. And so while this is built as self-consciously integrated, and Kazan said, the eyes of the nation will be on Rochdale Village to see if Black and white New Yorkers can live harmoniously and cooperatively together. Actually, 80% of the original cooperators were white New Yorkers, but today, this is the largest predominantly Black cooperative anywhere in the nation. Now, speaking of large cooperatives, we have ground broken in 1966 on Co-op City. It will open entirely in 1968. And it is the largest cooperative development in the world. It is the apotheosis of Kazan's ideas. And this was also, speaking of the Rockefellers, now in 1966, who's governor? Nelson Rockefeller. So when ground is broken here, who's there? We have Nelson Rockefeller, we have Robert Moses, we have Jacob Potofsky, who was a leader of the United Housing Foundation, and we have Abraham Kazan, all of whom are there. And when they break ground on this is in the Baychester section of the Bronx, on the site of the old Freedom Land amusement park. Rockefeller calls this a completely sound investment in a better society, which is how I got the name of this lecture. This is the world's largest cooperative development, home to over 15,000 families across 35 buildings. It was financed under Mitchell-Lama, and it still maintains its minimum and maximum income requirements. And the New York Times, when this was built, pointed out really wisely that Kazan and other leaders knew that people needed beauty as well as shelter. That comes out of the labor movement, the idea of bread and roses, that workers need bread, but they also need roses. And that can be really seen in architecture through the fact that 80% of the 320 acres at Co-op City were actually undeveloped. So 80% of the 320 acres that we see here are actually open land. And it was, again, this idea of, the apotheosis of what will come out of the garden apartment, that you can be a worker and you don't have to live cheek by jowl, that you can have all of this room. Now, what's interesting about this is that while many of the original cooperators came out of Kazan's sort of wheelhouse of the needle trades and the Jewish labor movement, today, Co-op City is actually over 60% Black and over 30% Hispanic. It also has, I think, the largest naturally occurring retirement community in the city, if not in the nation, which is because so many of the original cooperators actually still live there. Because again, it's this idea with cooperative housing that people who live in cooperative communities are specifically invested in their buildings. And I say that because that really brings us now to the 1970s, which is where we're gonna end. This is the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. In the 1970s, of course, New York City goes into a terrible depression, and the city is bankrupt. And so the real depth of that bankruptcy in the early 70s, 73, 74, we have the rise of the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, which realizes, as you can see here, is homesteading begins when families get tired of paying high rent for deteriorating housing, and instead of abandoning their homes as their landlords were doing, it was this question of, can we turn them into cooperatives? Can we turn them into communities? This question of how do we keep, originally with something like garden apartments, and then with Mitchell-Lama, it was how do you keep the middle class in New York? But with the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, it became, okay, how do you keep people within their communities? How do you keep the working class from a situation where, ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning, right? How do you keep these buildings standing, and how do you keep people inside of them? Well, within a year, by 1974, so the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board is founded in 1973, and by 1974, the organization had enabled the conversion of 1,600 foreclosed city-held units into resident-controlled cooperatives. So it was this idea of, okay, your landlord is going to abandon the building. Why doesn't the community itself band together to buy it? What also made this possible, in 1971, the city, for the first time, passed legislation that allowed mortgages on cooperatives. So a community of renters could come together and purchase the building in a cooperative way because they could mortgage it. So you have this incredible sort of outpouring of mutual aid within housing through the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board. And so when I think of the history of cooperative housing, that's where I want to end, because as we face a rent crisis today, I think that this gives us a really beautiful framework. That first of all, we can have dignified workers' housing in New York. We've done it. And also that when and if we have a situation as we see now that people are fleeing the city, if community members are invested in a cooperative way in their homes, in their communities, in their buildings, so on and so forth, that keeps people, A, in their homes, and B, in their communities, C, in New York City. We've seen it after World War I, we've seen it after World War II, we saw it in the 1970s, and we can see it today. And so when we look at the history of cooperative housing, it personally gives me an incredible amount of hope, because over and over and over again, we see the way that New Yorkers have really found solutions to this question of housing, and how can we live with dignity together in our communities. And I think that this is one way. So thank you so much. It has been wonderful, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them. I'm going to look at the chat function now. It's possible that people have put questions in the chat. I wasn't looking.
The only question in the chat that I saw was someone was asking why unions don't build housing now, and several people did give answers.
Okay, let me look. I'm just looking through the chat. Right. People are saying the same thing, which is that the power of unions has declined after, really, I would say after the 1960s, the power of union organizing in New York City and the share of New Yorkers who were members of labor unions began to decline. And so the idea of labor as a conspicuous political force wasn't really in the picture. Although today I would argue that that's changing. Oh, good question. Okay, were co-ops the first form of apartment ownership? When and why did condominiums start? That's a good question. So the condo comes on the scene in New York City in 1961. That's the first time legally that you can have a condo in New York. And the first part of the question though is, were co-ops the first form of apartment ownership? And to that, I would say yes. While you could own a full building prior to the cooperative, the idea of earning your apartment or a share in the apartment, obviously with a co-op you don't own the apartment. That's what a condo is. You own the apartment itself. But with the cooperative owning a share as opposed to owning the building, yes, that would have been the first time that was possible. How much conversation existed between Europe and the United States when Cop Village and Karl Marx Huff were both being built? I thought it was amusing that Jesser superimposed, I can't actually read what that says, at the base of the amalgamated housing on Ground Street. This question of how much conversation existed between builders in Europe and the United States, I don't have a wide enough understanding to accurately answer that question, so I'm not going to, because I don't want to give you, a half-baked answer on that. Is there cooperative housing elsewhere, or is this a housing model particular to New York City? No, there's cooperative housing all over the country and certainly throughout Europe, although the large-scale cooperative housing and labor cooperatives in general were limited pretty specifically to New York City. We don't see something like Co-op City anywhere else in the nation, that this was a really homegrown movement, that this was coming out of the New York labor movement in particular, especially because New York has actually had at one time, no longer does, but had the strongest labor unions in the nation. This is the largest city, and so it had the largest labor unions as well. And so just the sheer force of labor, I don't think is necessarily understood today. There was a great exhibit about this recently at the Museum of the City of New York, Labor in New York City, which is just the fact that I think it's important to realize that, in particular, say Brooklyn, between the Civil War and the Second World War, was actually known as the nation's grocery and hardware store, because we made everything on the East River. We made everything. And then on the Hudson Piers, everything that docked in New York, more goods were docking in New York by the turn of the 20th century than anywhere else in the world. And by the 1970s, it had really precipitously declined. But just the sheer force of the labor movement and of union workers in this city was unlike anywhere else in the nation, which is why you see this incredible large scale, in particular of labor housing. Is this type of housing possible given the power and reach of big developers? Has space and land become inaccessible to the middle and working classes? That's a really interesting question. I think it really depends who is in control of the land, right? We see now, this was true with Bloomberg, it's true with de Blasio, that city government is really selling the city to developers, right? And it's this idea, I live in Brooklyn, and so specifically along the waterfront, that, you know, in exchange for quote unquote parkland, like privately owned parkland that's now created by developers, and also by quote unquote affordable housing within these like giant steel and glass skyscrapers, you know, that developers can own the land. But what I will say is that there is tremendous community advocacy throughout New York City, and particularly in communities along the waterfront, because that is what's gentrifying fastest, as to, you know, who gets to own that land. And so I think it's always this question of who is the backer, right? If the backer is a private developer, then, you know, you see what goes on in the glass towers and so on. But if the backer is, you know, a mass labor union, it's something else. But again, this question of who has power. So I think, like, when I talk about something like the Urban Homesteading Assistance Board, it's that same union ethos, is that there's power in numbers. And so I think that it would not be impossible for sustained community advocacy to sort of shift the tide of what gets built where. I don't think, you know, I think this question of, is something even possible given XYZ? You know, I think, like, it's a question of, do you have hope for the city? You know, and I really do. Because when I look back at this history, I see over and over and over again these waves of ideas, these waves of advocacy. And so it's always after kind of a cataclysm, right? After World War I, after World War II, after an incredible depression in the 70s, we see these changes. And we're dealing with a cataclysm right now. And I think this city is going to look really different when we come out of this. And the question is, you know, who is going to be the change? And I have seen community advocacy specifically at this time, and I think that it is certainly not impossible that that will begin to shift the tide, especially because a full half of the apartments built in luxury towers between 2010 and 2010 and 2020 are uninhabited, right? So this question of who lives in the city, who stays in the city, I think that this is really going to change. So that's what I would say. Okay. Can I answer anything else? I know it is 7:30, so I think we're nearing our end point, but if I can answer anything else, I would be happy to.
I don't see any others. So thank you so much, Lucy. And thank you for everyone for joining us and for sticking around. We've gotten lots of comments that this is great, so thank you very much.
Wonderful. All right, have a great night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.